My name is Cassidy, and I am exactly 33 years old. 4 years ago, my parents kicked me out with a crumpled $50 bill and completely erased my existence. Then my sister stumbled across my name online and called them in a panic. Suddenly, the daughter they abandoned was family again. Within a single day, my phone simply would not stop ringing. 77 missed calls and endless frantic messages. I am the founder and chief executive officer of CW Holdings, a commercial real estate acquisitions firm based in San Francisco. It was a Tuesday morning, and I sat at the head of a massive glass table in our boardroom. We were 10 minutes away from finalizing a multi-million-dollar merger that would solidify my company as a dominant force in the Bay Area market. My legal team was reviewing the final clauses. Everything was going perfectly until my personal cell phone began vibrating against the polished glass. It buzzed once, then twice, then continuously. I glanced down at the screen. The caller identification showed my mother Patricia, then my father Thomas, then my sister Madison. They took turns calling me relentlessly. By the time I flipped the phone face down, I had exactly 77 missed calls. I ignored them completely and turned my attention back to the documents. A moment later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. My head of security stepped inside looking urgent. He walked briskly to my chair and leaned down to whisper in my ear. He told me a family was causing a chaotic scene down in the main lobby. They were screaming my name, refusing to leave, and threatening to call local news networks if I did not come down immediately. I excused myself from the executive meeting, smoothing down my tailored blazer, and stepped into the private elevator. When the elevator doors parted at the ground floor, the sheer volume of shouting hit me instantly. My mother Patricia was standing near the reception desk, waving a crumpled piece of paper. My father Thomas stood beside her with his chest puffed out in false authority. My sister Madison was dripping in designer brands from head to toe, looking distressed. And standing right behind Madison was her husband Kendrick, a man who loved playing the role of a brilliant Silicon Valley entrepreneur. The moment my mother spotted me stepping out of the elevator, she charged forward. Before my security team could intercept her, she violently threw the crumpled paper directly at my chest. It fluttered to the marble floor. I did not even need to look at it to know what it was. It was a commercial rent increase notice. Did you think changing your company name to CW Holdings meant I would not find you? My mother screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. You hiked Kendrick's startup office rent by 300%. Are you trying to kill this family out of pure jealousy? I calmly adjusted my cuffs. I bought that commercial building last month, Mom. It is a prime piece of real estate, and the rent is simply being adjusted to match the current market value. Madison pushed past our mother, wiping imaginary tears from her eyes. You are doing this on purpose, Cassidy, she cried, her voice shaking with manufactured heartbreak. You are punishing us for not letting you sleep on our couch 4 years ago. You are trying to destroy my husband's business just because you hold a grudge about the past. I stared at my sister, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. You did not deny me a couch, Madison. I fired back, my voice ringing with a cold, hard authority that silenced the entire lobby. Dad threw a $50 bill at my face and kicked me out into the pouring rain because I refused to co-sign a fraudulent $100,000 bank loan for your luxury wedding. You needed someone with good credit to exploit, and when I refused to ruin my financial future for your vanity, you threw me away. That $50 was my severance package from this family. Do not stand in my lobby and play the victim. My father Thomas stepped forward, his face red with indignation. How dare you speak to your sister that way? He shouted. We raised you to support this family, and you turned your back on us. Now you have money and use it to strangle your brother-in-law. I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. I did not turn my back on you, Dad. I simply stopped allowing you to use me. Business is business. If Kendrick wants to keep his premium office space, he pays the premium price just like every other tenant. Kendrick finally stepped out from behind my sister. He wore an immaculate custom suit and an arrogant grin that made my blood boil. He casually adjusted his expensive watch and pulled a folded legal document from his inside pocket. He held it up for me to see, tapping the paper with confidence. "My lawyer already reviewed your little notice, Cassidy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked around the lobby, making sure my employees and security staff were listening. "You clearly do not understand how commercial leases work in this city. You do not have the power to evict me. You do not have the right to demand more money from my minority-owned business, and you definitely lack the legal authority to enforce this ridiculous rent hike. You picked a fight with the wrong man today. I will make sure the internet turns against your company if you try to fight me." Kendrick shoved the crumpled lease agreement back into my personal space, practically hitting my chin with the stapled packet. He turned his body slightly, ensuring that every security guard, receptionist, and passing executive in my lobby had a clear view of his performance. He was playing to an audience. He always did. "You see, Cassidy," he began, his voice booming with forced theatrical confidence, "I am not just some random tenant you can bully out of a building to make a quick profit. I am a minority tech founder in Silicon Valley. I have major investor backing. I have deep media connections. I have a whole network of people who are absolutely exhausted by corporate vultures like you stepping on the little guy to inflate your bottom line." Madison nodded vigorously beside him, clinging to his tailored arm. "Tell her, baby," she chirped, shooting me a venomous glare that transported me right back to our toxic childhood. "She is just jealous that you are building something real while she just buys other people's hard work." "This lease," Kendrick continued, tapping the paper violently with his index finger, "gives me specific commercial tenant protections. Your little acquisition of the building does not magically erase my legal rights. If you push this eviction, I am going to march right out of these glass doors and tell the local and national press exactly what you are doing. I will tell them CW Holdings is actively engaging in discriminatory corporate bullying. I will spin a narrative so toxic that your company name will be dragged through the mud before your precious multi-million-dollar merger even closes." The grand lobby fell completely silent. A few of my junior analysts who had stopped to watch the commotion exchanged nervous glances. Kendrick stood tall, adjusting his expensive lapels, basking in the heavy silence. He thought he had paralyzed me. He thought the threat of a public relations nightmare would make me cower and apologize, just like it always made my parents bend to his every whim. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the emotional reaction they were so desperately craving. I simply turned my head slightly and gave a brief nod to Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, who had quietly stepped out of the private elevator behind me. Marcus walked forward in his impeccably tailored gray suit, holding an encrypted digital tablet. He handed it directly to me without saying a single word. I swiped the screen, unlocking the digital ledger for the newly acquired commercial property on Market Street. I looked down at the glowing red numbers, digested the data, and then looked right back into Kendrick's smug eyes. "You have a fascinating imagination, Kendrick," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous clinical quiet that echoed through the vast marble space. "You speak with such authority about your legal protections and your commercial rights. You use all the right buzzwords to sound like a victim, but you missed a rather crucial detail in your grand performance." I held up the tablet so the bright financial readout faced him directly. "Your lease did not have magical protections." I continued, cutting through his bravado like a surgical scalpel. "Your lease had an expiration date. Specifically, it expired exactly 60 days ago. You never signed a renewal with the previous building owner. You never negotiated an extension. You simply stayed in the premium office space, hoping the old management would be too disorganized to notice you were flying under the radar." Kendrick's confident smile faltered. His jaw tightened, but he tried to maintain his rigid posture. "We were in negotiations," he stammered, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave as the reality of the situation began to set in. "Verbal negotiations. Verbal negotiations do not hold up in commercial real estate," I countered, smoothly swiping to the next page of the financial dossier. "And neither do empty bank accounts. According to the financial disclosures I acquired along with the building deed, you have not paid a single dime of base rent in 2 entire months. You are not a persecuted tech founder, Kendrick. You are officially a squatter." Madison gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. "That is a lie," she shrieked, looking at her husband in a panic. "Tell her that is a lie, Kendrick. We pay our rent. We have plenty of capital." Kendrick refused to look at his wife. He stared at me, a thick vein pulsing visibly in his neck. "The previous owner understood our cash flow situation," he muttered, leaning closer to me, trying to drop his voice so my employees would not hear the embarrassing truth. "Startups have lean months. He was giving us leniency until our next funding round cleared." I smiled, but there was zero warmth in it. "The previous owner is currently sitting on a luxury yacht in the Mediterranean because I bought him out. I do not offer leniency. I do not subsidize failing business ventures. And I certainly do not let arrogant men squat in my premium real estate for free while they threaten to smear my name in the press." I stepped closer, forcing him to take a half step back in his expensive Italian shoes. "You owe my company $42,000 in back rent and late penalties," I stated clearly, ensuring the exact dollar amount echoed across the lobby for everyone to hear. "Your little piece of paper is completely worthless. You have 48 hours to clear your mismatched desks out of my building, or my property managers will legally lock the doors and auction off your equipment to recoup your massive debt." Kendrick's face drained of all color. The arrogant Silicon Valley persona vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold legal reality had completely boxed him into a corner. He had brought a loud bluff to a corporate boardroom fight. That was exactly when my father decided to intervene. Thomas stormed forward, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. He shoved his way past Kendrick and planted himself directly in front of me. The veins in his forehead were bulging against his skin. For a second, looking at his furious expression, I saw the exact same man who had thrown a $50 bill at me and slammed the front door in my face 4 years ago. "You listen to me, you ungrateful brat!" my father roared, pointing a trembling finger right between my eyes. "You have no idea what you are doing. You are trying to sabotage this family out of pure spite because you were never the favorite." I did not flinch. "I am running a profitable business, Dad. If you want to run a charity, you can pay his back rent yourself." My father slammed his hand down on the edge of the polished reception desk, making the marble ring loudly. "You are going to back off and leave his office space alone," he demanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Kendrick is not a squatter. He is a visionary. He is on the verge of something massive, and you are too blind to see it." He paused, puffing out his chest as if he were delivering the ultimate checkmate to a difficult opponent. "Kendrick is closing a $5 million Series A funding round next week," my father shouted, a triumphant gleam returning to his wide eyes. "Do you hear me? $5 million. He is talking to top-tier investors. His software is going to revolutionize the entire market. You are trying to evict him just days before he becomes 10 times wealthier than you will ever be. You are pathetic, Cassidy. Kendrick is the future of this family." $5 million, Cassidy. You hear me? Thomas slammed his fist so hard against the marble desk that a decorative pen holder rattled. "You are going to write off that back rent right now. You are going to extend his commercial lease for free. When Kendrick's Series A clears next week, he is going to buy your entire building and fire you just for the satisfaction of it. You owe this to your family. You owe him this financial runway." Madison crossed her arms, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet to ensure the lobby lights caught the stones perfectly. "It is called equity, Cassidy," she sneered. "Kendrick is building a unicorn. You just buy old brick buildings and collect rent like a glorified debt collector. You have absolutely no idea how the tech world operates. You should be begging him for stock options right now instead of harassing him over petty cash." I looked at my father and then at my sister. My father's chest was heaving with righteous indignation. He fully believed every single word coming out of his own mouth. He believed he was defending a misunderstood genius. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the betrayal that had scarred me when they left me homeless. I simply held out my right hand. Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, placed a thick red financial dossier into my palm. It was heavy. It contained the absolute destruction of Kendrick's carefully crafted illusion. A Series A funding round requires extreme due diligence, Dad, I said evenly, tapping the cover of the red folder. Venture capital firms employ forensic accountants to audit every single line of code, every server log, and every bank statement before they hand over $5 million. Do you know what my acquisition team does when we buy a massive commercial property? We do the exact same thing. We audit the tenants. We ran a complete forensic background check on your golden boy the minute my phone started ringing with your 77 missed calls. Kendrick shifted his weight nervously. His eyes darted toward the heavy glass exit doors. You have no right to look into my proprietary corporate data, he snapped, his voice pitching higher than before. You are sitting in my building, Kendrick, I fired back, taking a step closer. Your data is my business, and according to my team, your brilliant tech startup does not actually exist. There is no software. There is not a single line of proprietary code. You have 2 unpaid college interns building wireframes on free open-source platforms. You do not have a product. You do not have users. You certainly do not have top-tier investors lining up to give you $5 million. Your entire company is an empty shell designed to make you look important at country club cocktail parties. You are lying, my father roared, though his voice wavered slightly as he looked at the thick red folder. Kendrick showed me the term sheets. He showed me the investor commitments. He has funding. He is expanding. I opened the red folder and pulled out a stack of banking records. I slid them across the sleek marble reception desk right under my father's nose. He does not have funding, Dad. He has you. I pointed to the highlighted yellow lines on the top page, tracing the numbers with my manicured finger. 6 months ago, the previous landlord threatened to evict Kendrick for non-payment. Suddenly, Kendrick started making partial payments of $7,000 a month just to keep the lights on and maintain his fake chief executive lifestyle. But those wire transfers did not come from a corporate revenue account. They did not come from angel investors. They came directly from a personal wealth management account. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the cold lobby. The only sound was the faint hum of the elevator banks. They came from your retirement fund, Dad, I said, my voice slicing through the quiet room. Every single month for the past half year, you have been secretly draining your life savings to pay rent for a fake company. You are funding his delusion. You are paying for the office space where he sits and pretends to be a billionaire. Madison spun around to look at her husband. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor. Kendrick, what is she talking about? You told me the investors were covering the overhead. You told me my dad was just an early-stage board member. Why is she saying my dad is paying your rent? Kendrick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a cornered animal. He looked at Thomas, pleading silently with his eyes for a rescue that was never going to come. Thomas stared down at the bank statements on the marble desk. The yellow highlights glared back at him, exposing his massive financial bleeding in front of everyone. His face went completely pale. The aggressive, dominant patriarch who had kicked me out into the rain 4 years ago was suddenly looking at his own financial ruin. My mother, Patricia, had been standing quietly processing the absolute destruction of her perfect family narrative. For years, she had bragged to her wealthy friends about her brilliant tech founder's son-in-law. She had used his phantom success to mask her own deep insecurities. Now, standing in the lobby of a major corporation owned by the daughter she threw away, the humiliation crashed over her like a tidal wave. But Patricia was incapable of admitting fault. She was incapable of looking at Kendrick and demanding accountability. Her brain needed a scapegoat, and I was standing right in front of her holding the evidence. The illusion was shattered, and her husband's retirement was gone. The raw, blinding embarrassment mutated instantly into violent rage. She let out a guttural scream. Her eyes went completely wild. She lunged across the wide marble reception desk, her arm swinging back with full force, aiming a vicious open-handed slap directly at my face. I did not even blink. Before her hand could make contact, my head of security stepped forward with lightning speed. He caught her wrist mid-air, his massive hand locking around her forearm like a steel vise. He held her there, suspended awkwardly over the desk as she struggled wildly. "Let me go!" Patricia shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. She thrashed against the security guard, kicking at the marble desk with her expensive heels. She glared at me with absolute pure hatred. "You are making this up. You forged these papers. You are doing this just to destroy your sister's marriage." Kendrick saw the absolute, undeniable proof of his financial parasitism lying right there on the marble desk. He looked at my security chief, whose grip was still firmly locked like a steel vise around Patricia's wrist. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his arrogant facade. He could not win on paper. He could not win in a courtroom. He certainly could not win in a financial audit. So he did what all cornered manipulators do. He pivoted to social warfare. Kendrick grabbed Patricia by the shoulder and roughly yanked her backward away from my security detail. He straightened his custom blazer and took a deliberate step toward me. The panic that had flashed in his eyes just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He looked me up and down, taking his time to sneer at my tailored suit, the expensive artwork hanging on the lobby walls, and the general aura of corporate wealth that surrounded me. "You think you are untouchable because you have money now, Cassidy," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch that was meant to be intimidating. "You think because you can buy a building and hire a team of lawyers that you hold all the cards? You really think a few printed bank statements mean absolutely anything in the real world?" I held his gaze perfectly still. "In the business world, Kendrick numbers are the only things that matter." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That is where you are wrong. You are so busy playing the ruthless corporate executive that you forgot how the actual world works today. Tomorrow morning, I am going to show the world exactly who you are. I am going to drag your precious CW holdings through the mud, and you will not be able to stop me." He stepped even closer, pointing a finger at my chest. "I am a black tech founder in Silicon Valley. Do you have any idea how much the media loves a story about a minority-owned business being crushed by corporate greed? I am going to go to every major news outlet, every tech blog, and every social media platform. I am going to tell them how a wealthy, ruthless, racist corporate landlord swooped in and illegally evicted a promising startup just days before they secured major funding. I will tell them you locked the doors on innovation to build another soulless high-rise." Madison immediately sensed the shift in tactics and jumped right back into her role as the supportive, victimized wife. She wiped her dry eyes and glared at me. "You are going to be canceled, Cassidy." She spat out the word like it was a weapon. "When the internet gets a hold of this story, your investors are going to run for the hills. That multi-million-dollar merger you are so proud of will collapse overnight. No one will want to do business with a racist billionaire who destroys small companies out of petty family jealousy." My father, Thomas, puffed his chest out again, emboldened by Kendrick's new angle of attack. "You brought this on yourself," he declared loudly. "You could have just forgiven the debt. You could have supported your family. Now you are going to lose everything you built because you wanted to play hardball with the wrong man." I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder in their shared delusion. They honestly believed they could bully me into submission with the threat of bad public relations. I motioned for my security chief to release his defensive stance. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, Kendrick," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "After that, the locks change and your equipment belongs to me. Have a wonderful afternoon." I turned my back on them and walked straight toward the private elevator. I could hear Kendrick shouting threats behind me, promising to ruin my name, promising to make me regret this day. I stepped into the elevator, and the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off their desperate noise. I went right back up to the boardroom and successfully closed my merger. I did not give them another thought for the rest of the workday. Later that evening, I was standing in the kitchen of my downtown penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline, a stark contrast to the dark, rainy street my father had kicked me out onto 4 years earlier. I was pouring myself a glass of sparkling water when my private cell phone began to ring. The caller identification showed the name of my director of public relations. I answered the call, expecting a routine update on the merger announcement. Instead, my PR director was speaking so fast she was practically breathless. "Cassidy, you need to get online right now," she said, her voice laced with absolute panic. "We have a massive crisis on our hands." I set my glass down on the granite counter. "Speak clearly. What is happening?" "It is your sister and her husband," my director replied. "They just posted a video on social media and it is completely blowing up. It already has hundreds of thousands of views across multiple platforms, and major tech journalists are starting to share it." I walked over to my laptop on the kitchen island and opened it. "What exactly does the video say?" "It is a highly edited, incredibly manipulative piece of content," my director explained frantically. "Your brother-in-law is standing in front of his empty office space, talking about how his minority-owned startup is being systematically destroyed by CW Holdings. He is painting you as a predatory landlord who specifically targets vulnerable business owners. Your sister is sitting next to him, holding a dog, and crying about how corporate greed is ruining their lives. They are calling for a public boycott of our firm. The comments section is a nightmare, Cassidy. People are calling you a monster. They are digging up our corporate phone numbers and leaving death threats. The investors for the new merger have already started sending emails asking for an immediate explanation. We need to draft an emergency apology and statement right now before this destroys the entire deal." I stared at the screen as the viral video began to autoplay. There was Madison squeezing out fake tears for the camera. There was Kendrick delivering a passionate, Oscar-worthy monologue about oppression and corporate bullying. They thought they had finally found the weapon that would break me. They thought I would panic and surrender to the court of public opinion. "Do not draft an apology," I told my PR director, my voice chillingly calm. "But Cassidy," she protested, "this is a public relations disaster." I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. "Let it burn for 24 hours. I am going to end this permanently." I stared at the screen as the video looped for the second time. It was a masterclass in modern digital manipulation. Kendrick was standing in front of the sweeping glass windows of the Market Street office, looking solemn and defeated. He had intentionally removed his custom Rolex and traded his tailored blazer for a plain gray hoodie. He looked like the quintessential hard-working startup founder on the brink of changing the world, suddenly crushed by the boot of corporate America. Madison sat slightly behind him on a minimalist sofa, clutching her purebred teacup Pomeranian to her chest. She was perfectly styled to look unstyled, her mascara subtly smudged to imply hours of weeping. "My name is Kendrick." He began, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "For the past year, my team and I have poured our souls into building a platform that will democratize tech access for minority communities. We were just days away from securing our Series A funding, but today, the billionaire executives at CW Holdings bought our building and served us with an immediate illegal eviction notice. They hiked our rent by 300%. When I tried to explain that we were a minority-owned business on the verge of a breakthrough, their CEO literally laughed in my face. He paused, looking down at his hands before staring directly into the camera lens. "They do not care about innovation. They do not care about marginalized founders. They just want to clear us out so they can build another soulless high-rise for the ultra-wealthy. We are being bullied out of our own headquarters by a faceless predatory corporation." Madison buried her face in the dog's fur, letting out a perfectly timed, heart-wrenching sob. Kendrick wrapped a protective arm around her shaking shoulders. "Please," he pleaded, looking into the camera. "Share this. Do not let CW Holdings silence us." It was brilliant in its sheer, unadulterated malice. They completely omitted the fact that I was his sister-in-law. They deliberately erased the reality that my father was illegally funding his fake company using his retirement accounts. By removing the familial connection, Kendrick had successfully framed the narrative as a classic David versus Goliath battle. I was no longer a sister dealing with a toxic parasitic family member. I was a ruthless, nameless, racist billionaire crushing a helpless minority entrepreneur, and the internet was eating it up. The view counter ticked past 500,000. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of outrage. People were posting the address of my corporate headquarters. Activist accounts with millions of followers were retweeting the video calling for immediate boycotts of CW Holdings. A prominent tech blog had just published an article titled, "The Face of Corporate Greed," featuring a massive photo of my face next to a weeping Madison. My personal phone buzzed again, slicing through the quiet of my penthouse. It was not my PR director this time. The caller ID showed Arthur Sterling, the lead partner at Sterling Equity, the primary venture capital firm, backing my upcoming merger. I took a deep breath and answered, "Cassidy, what in God's name is happening over there?" Arthur barked, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "My phone has been blowing up for the last hour. We have board members asking if we are partnering with a slumlord. The optics on this are an absolute nightmare. We are 48 hours away from finalizing a $70 million merger, and your face is currently trending under the hashtag boycott CW Holdings." "Arthur," I said, maintaining my calm, even tone, "the video is a complete fabrication. The tenant is over 60 days delinquent on rent and his lease expired 2 months ago. It is a standard commercial eviction." "The internet does not care about commercial lease expirations," Cassidy Arthur snapped. "They care about optics. They care about a crying woman and a minority founder getting crushed by a billionaire. You need to fix this right now. You need to issue a public apology, waive his back rent, and let him keep the damn office space. Give him a 10-year free lease if you have to. Just make the hashtag go away, or my partners are pulling out of the merger in the morning." The line went dead. Before I could even set the phone down, my laptop chimed with an urgent video conference request. My own board of directors had convened an emergency late-night meeting. I clicked join, and the screen populated with the grim, panicked faces of my 5 senior board members. "Cassidy, my chief operating officer, started immediately. We are hemorrhaging goodwill. 2 of our secondary investors just sent emails expressing severe reservations about the merger. We have news vans parking outside the lobby. You have to back down. Draft an apology video immediately. Tell the public it was a systemic error, a miscommunication by the property management team. Tell them Kendrick can keep the office. If we fight this in the press, we will lose everything." I looked at the grid of panicked faces on my screen. They were seasoned corporate veterans, men and women who managed millions of dollars daily, and they were completely terrified by a 2-minute video recorded on a smartphone. They wanted me to bend the knee. They wanted me to reward the very people who had emotionally and financially abused me just to make a temporary public relations problem disappear. I thought about my father standing in my lobby earlier that day, demanding I subsidize Kendrick's delusion. I thought about Madison's smirk. I thought about the cold rain soaking my clothes 4 years ago when my family decided I was completely disposable. I was not going to give them my building. I was not going to give them my reputation. "No!" I said, my voice cutting through the panicked chatter of my board members. "I am not issuing an apology, and I am certainly not giving that fraud a free lease." "Cassidy, be reasonable," my COO pleaded. "The internet mob will destroy this company." I leaned closer to the camera, my eyes locking onto the lens. "When my family threw me out onto the street with nothing but a $50 bill, I did not cry. I learned forensic accounting. Let them have the internet for 24 hours. We are going to follow the money." I did not sleep that night. I transformed my penthouse dining room into a corporate war room. Marcus arrived at midnight bringing 3 of our top forensic data analysts and an encrypted server rack. We completely ignored the buzzing phones, the trending hashtags, and the frantic social media notifications lighting up our screens. The digital mob was screaming for my head, demanding I surrender my property to a crying woman and her dog. I knew the internet's memory was short and driven by raw emotion. Financial fraud, however, left a permanent, irrefutable paper trail. The investigation protocol. We started by pulling every public and private record connected to Kendrick's name. My team bypassed the polished tech blogs and social media PR campaigns, going straight for the raw data. We requested LLC filings in Delaware shell companies registered in Nevada and offshore accounts routed through the Cayman Islands. It was a labyrinth of deliberate corporate misdirection. Kendrick had created an incredibly complex illusion of a sprawling tech empire, but my analysts were trained to dismantle corporate structures brick by brick. I stood over the kitchen island drinking black coffee, and watching Marcus trace a web of highly suspicious wire transfers. As the data populated on the glowing monitors, my mind flashed back to our family Thanksgiving dinners, the Thanksgiving mirage. I remembered sitting at the far end of the long mahogany dining table, exhausted to my bones. I was working 80-hour weeks as a junior acquisitions analyst, making barely enough to cover my rent in the city. I was learning the brutal, unforgiving reality of commercial real estate from the ground up. My father would not even look in my direction during those dinners. Instead, he would raise his crystal wine glass and propose a grand toast to Kendrick's relentless hustle. Kendrick would sit at the head of the table next to my father, spinning elaborate tales about beta testing, user acquisition metrics, and disrupting the digital landscape. He threw around tech jargon like confetti. My father ate up every single word, mocking my traditional corporate job as outdated and unimaginative. He called me a glorified paper pusher and a corporate drone while praising Kendrick as a brilliant visionary. Madison would smile smugly, swirling her expensive wine paid for by the very man she was currently destroying on the internet. I realized now, staring at the empty bank ledgers on my screen, that Kendrick's entire existence was a carefully constructed mirage. His life was a facade built entirely on my father's gullibility and desperate need to be associated with Silicon Valley prestige. Following the money look at this structure, one of the senior analysts said, tapping her monitor. We clustered around her workstation. She brought up a visual map of Kendrick's business history. Kendrick had registered 6 different corporate entities in the last 3 years. Every single company had a name designed to sound like a cutting-edge tech startup. Every single company had 0 employees on payroll, 0 active patents, and 0 registered software licenses. What they did have were massive, inexplicable influxes of cash. The cash was absolutely not coming from venture capitalists or angel investors. Every single wire transfer originated from a series of holding accounts directly tied to Thomas Wilson, my father. He had been systematically liquidating his municipal bonds, his mutual funds, and his blue-chip stock portfolios. He was bleeding his own generational wealth dry to fund a man who spent his days buying custom Italian suits and writing press releases for software that did not exist. My father had financed Kendrick's luxury cars, Madison's designer wardrobe, and the premium office space they were currently squatting in. By 4 in the morning, the city below my penthouse was dark and quiet, but our war room was buzzing with sharp adrenaline. We had successfully mapped out the entire geography of the fraud, but there was one massive piece of the puzzle that still did not fit. Kendrick had been boasting loudly in my lobby about a $5 million Series A funding round. My father had screamed about it, defending Kendrick's honor like a loyal soldier. We needed to find the source of that specific delusion. The ultimate betrayal. My lead data analyst, a brilliant young woman named Elena, suddenly stood up from her ergonomic chair. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and turned her large monitor so I could clearly see the highlighted spreadsheet. Ms. Cassidy, Elena said, her voice tight with disbelief. I just tracked the largest single transfer in the entire network. Your father wired $500,000 to Kendrick's primary business account exactly 3 weeks ago. It was officially coded and labeled as seed capital for software development. I leaned in, resting my hands on the desk and examining the complex routing numbers. Where did the money go, Elena? I asked, my voice clinical and cold. Did he pay a development team? Did he buy servers? That is the thing, Miss Cassidy, she replied, bringing up a separate tracking document encrypted by the bank. The $500,000 did not go to software development. It did not go to payroll, marketing, or hardware. The exact moment the funds cleared Kendrick's business account, they were immediately transferred to an anonymous blind trust. Elena clicked one final key, revealing the ultimate destination of my father's liquidated life savings. Ms. Cassidy, the $500,000 your father wired to Kendrick's business account last month did not go to software development. It went directly into a real estate escrow account. Elena's fingers flew across the backlit keyboard. The dual monitors reflected in her glasses as she bypassed layers of standard corporate privacy shields. The $500,000 had moved through 3 different wire transfers in under 48 hours before settling into an escrow account held by a premier real estate brokerage in the city. Pull the property records, I instructed, leaning over Elena's shoulder. I want the exact address, and I want the name on the finalized deed. Kendrick is sloppy, but he's not stupid enough to put a luxury asset under a shell company facing imminent default. Elena executed a swift public records search, cross-referencing the escrow routing number. The property flashed onto the screen. It was a 3-bedroom luxury condominium in Pacific Heights. The listing photos showed wraparound floor-to-ceiling windows, a private rooftop terrace, and a custom marble kitchen. It was the kind of real estate reserved exclusively for venture capitalists and tech billionaires. My father had literally drained his retirement to buy Kendrick a multi-million-dollar playground. Check the deed, I said, crossing my arms. He probably put it in Madison's name to shield it from his corporate creditors. Elena shook her head, her eyes narrowing at the dense digital document. No, Ms. Cassidy, the deed is not registered to your sister. It is not registered to Kendrick either. Who owns the condo, Elena? The title is registered to a woman named Mia Thorne. Elena read, clicking through another database to pull a comprehensive background profile. She is 24 years old. Her primary occupation is listed as a social media influencer. Marcus stepped up beside me, staring at the screen. He pulled his phone from his inside jacket pocket and typed the name into a social media search. He turned the glowing screen toward me. Mia Thorne was a prominent Instagram model. Her feed was an endless scroll of designer handbags, exotic vacations, and mirror selfies in high-end boutiques. The most recent photos featured her standing on the exact private rooftop terrace of the Pacific Heights condominium my father had unwittingly purchased for her. The caption read simply, "New beginnings." Why would Kendrick buy a luxury condo for a 24-year-old model, I asked, though the sickening reality was already crystallizing in my mind. Let us look at the corporate expense ledger. Elena said, her fingers flying across the keys again. If he is routing real estate purchases through his business accounts, he might be running other personal expenses through the company as well. Let us check his corporate medical insurance plan. Startups have to file basic employee health coverage disclosures. Elena bypassed the primary commercial registry and accessed the insurance provider attached to Kendrick's LLC. The plan was billed as a premium executive healthcare package. It covered exactly 2 people. Kendrick was listed as the primary policyholder. Mia Thorne is listed as his sole corporate dependent. Elena said, her voice dropping to a shocked whisper. She is registered under the company health plan as a senior software consultant. But look at the actual insurance claims, Ms. Cassidy. I leaned closer, tracing the itemized billing codes on the screen. There were no claims for routine checkups or dental cleanings. The billing history was exclusively tied to a high-end private maternity clinic in Beverly Hills. There were charges for specialized ultrasounds, prenatal vitamins, and a massive deposit for a private luxury birthing suite. She is 6 months pregnant, I stated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Kendrick was not just running a fake software company. He was not just stealing my father's hard-earned life savings to play pretend in Silicon Valley. He was actively using my family's money to fund a secret second family. Madison's flawless, visionary husband, the man she had just fiercely defended on a viral video while sobbing into her designer dog, was buying a luxury penthouse for his pregnant 24-year-old mistress, using the retirement funds of the very man who despised me for being a failure. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Kendrick had weaponized my father's desperation for status and Madison's desperation for a perfect image. He had drained them dry, and he was preparing to leave them both with absolutely nothing. When the fake Series A funding inevitably failed to materialize, Kendrick would simply declare corporate bankruptcy. He would walk away clean, leaving my father holding the empty bag while he moved into a paid-off penthouse with his new family. Madison would be left defending a ghost. And they had the audacity to call me a monster on the internet. I stood up slowly, stepping back from the glow of the monitors. The penthouse was dead silent. Even Marcus, the most stoic corporate lawyer I knew, looked completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic magnitude of the fraud. I held the absolute destruction of my sister's marriage and my father's ego right in the palm of my hand. One leaked document, one strategic anonymous email to a gossip blog, and Kendrick's carefully crafted victim narrative would evaporate. The internet mob would turn on him before sunrise. I could destroy him permanently. I could show the world the exact face of the man painting me as a corporate villain. Before I could utter a single command to my team, the harsh ringtone of my private cell phone shattered the quiet room. I glanced at the screen resting on the granite kitchen island. The caller ID displayed my father's name. It was 4:30 in the morning. He never called me. He certainly never called me in the middle of the night. He only ever communicated through rage and demands. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, pressing the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. "Cassidy," my father said. His voice was completely stripped of the booming, aggressive authority he had wielded in my lobby just 12 hours ago. It sounded thin, ragged, and coded in a desperate, terrifying panic. "You need to stop what you are doing right now. If you try to evict Kendrick or retaliate against that video, I will make sure you end up in a federal prison. I know exactly what you did." I kept the phone pressed to my ear, letting the silence stretch out for a long, measured moment. My father's ragged breathing filled the quiet space of my corporate war room. The threat hung in the air, heavy and desperate. He had just promised to send me to a federal prison, claiming he knew exactly what I had done. "What exactly did I do, Thomas?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Do not play games with me, Cassidy," he snarled, his panic morphing back into his trademark hostility. "You think you are so smart. You think you built CW Holdings out of thin air. I know you stole your initial seed money from my private business accounts before you left. Kendrick had his forensic team look into your early LLC filings. We are going to the press tomorrow morning. I will personally tell every tech journalist in this city that you are a thief and a fraudulent executive. Your little $70 million merger will be dead by noon." I actually laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the high ceilings of my penthouse, causing Marcus and Elena to look up from their monitors. Kendrick did not have a forensic team. Kendrick did not even have a functioning software license. He was just feeding my father another desperate fabricated lie to keep the money flowing and to turn my own family into his personal attack dogs. But my father was not finished. He needed me to capitulate, and his threats were quickly unspooling into a frantic, breathless confession. "You are going to log onto your computer right now and issue a formal public statement clearing Kendrick's name," he demanded, his voice cracking under the strain. "You are going to state that the eviction was a clerical error. You are going to waive his back rent, and you are going to give him a permanent lease. You owe me this, Cassidy. You owe me your life. I raised you. I clothed you. You will fix this public relations nightmare right now." "Why are you so utterly desperate to protect a man who has not produced a single line of code in 3 years?" I asked, leaning over the kitchen island. "Because if he goes down, I lose the house," he shouted, the truth finally ripping through his aggressive facade. The admission hung suspended in the dead air of the early morning. I gripped the edge of the granite counter. While he spoke, I caught Elena's eye and mouthed a single command. "Trace the origination." Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard, tracking backward from the $500,000 wire transfer to find exactly where my father had sourced the cash. "What did you do?" I asked, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "I took out a home equity line of credit on the Springfield estate," my father confessed, his words spilling out in a rush of panicked justification. "I took out a massive HELOC to get Kendrick that $500,000 bridge loan. He needed the capital to secure his Series A funding. He promised me a 10 times return when the venture capitalists signed the paperwork. But if you evict him, the investors will walk away. If his company goes under, I will default on the loan. The bank will foreclose on the mansion. You are going to make me homeless, Cassidy." The sheer profound irony of his statement washed over me. I closed my eyes, and the memory of a dark, freezing night 4 years ago played vividly in my mind. I was standing in the grand foyer of that exact same Springfield mansion, shivering in a thin coat. Madison was upstairs trying on a custom-imported wedding dress that cost more than my annual salary. I had just found the financial documents on my father's desk. I had begged him, crying and pleading for him not to liquidate his conservative investments to fund Madison's $250,000 wedding spectacle. I had shown him the math. I had explained that he was destroying his credit and leveraging his future for a single day of fake prestige. He had grabbed me by the arm and physically shoved me toward the front door. He had looked at me with utter disgust, his face contorted in anger. He had called me a worthless liability. He told me I was a jealous, bitter child because I was too busy being a failure to appreciate my sister's success. Then he had thrown me out into the pouring rain with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single $50 bill. He did not care about making me homeless then. He did not care that I had to sleep on a friend's couch and eat plain rice for 6 months while I built my consulting firm from scratch. Now he was standing in the very house he had kicked me out of, begging me to save him from his own spectacular stupidity. Elena tapped her monitor, drawing my attention. She had successfully traced the origination of the loan. The screen displayed the official digital deed to the Springfield mansion, accompanied by a commercial lending contract. The logo at the top of the loan document was a sleek silver triangle. "You are going to fix this, Cassidy," my father barked, trying to regain his dominant authority over the phone. "You are going to clear his name today. If you do not, I am calling the Wall Street Journal at dawn. I will tell them you embezzled your startup capital from your own family. I will ruin you." I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing monitor. I looked at the 24-year-old Instagram model's luxury condo deed. I looked at the Beverly Hills maternity clinic invoices. My father was threatening to destroy my entire life to protect a man who was actively draining his life savings to buy a penthouse for his pregnant mistress. I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that felt entirely new on my face. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational pitch. "You took out that HELOC with Apex Financial, right?" The line went dead silent. I could hear the sudden shift in his breathing. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice trembling with new uncertainty. I ignored his question. "Apex Financial is a very aggressive lender, Dad. They specialize in high-risk residential equity lines. They also have a very strict default policy. If you miss a single payment, they initiate foreclosure proceedings within 30 days. "What does that have to do with anything?" he demanded, panic rising in his throat again. "You just do what I told you to do and fix the media narrative." I leaned casually against the granite counter, locking eyes with Marcus, who was already anticipating my next move. "Have you ever bothered to check the name of Apex Financial's parent company?" I asked. He did not answer. I let the silence stretch, ensuring the realization would hit him with the maximum possible force before I delivered the final blow. "Apex Financial is a wholly owned subsidiary of CW Holdings," I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable. "I own the bank, Dad. I own the debt on your house. And when Kendrick defaults on your little bridge loan because he spent your $500,000 on a luxury condo for his pregnant 24-year-old mistress, I am going to be the one signing your foreclosure papers." I pressed the end call button and set the phone face down on the marble counter, leaving him in pure, unadulterated terror. The silence in the war room was absolute. I watched the digital dashboard tracking the social media metrics across the massive monitors. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then right around 6 in the morning, the impossible occurred. The viral video vanished. The primary link dissolved into a generic error page. Kendrick's entire social media account was suddenly deactivated. The fabricated digital mob that had been screaming for my head was left swinging at thin air. My father had clearly relayed my message. The sheer terror of losing his mansion had successfully bridged the gap between his study and Kendrick's fake headquarters. I went into the office at 8 o'clock that morning, feeling more energized than I had in years. The usual corporate chaos of CW Holdings felt manageable, perfectly structured. At precisely 10 o'clock, my executive assistant knocked on my door. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope, completely out of place among the usual stack of commercial leases and legal briefings. It had been hand-delivered by a private courier. I sliced open the heavy paper. Inside was a lavish gold foil invitation. The thick textured cardstock formally requested my presence at the annual family Thanksgiving dinner at the Atherton estate. I stared at the looping, elegant calligraphy. It was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. Less than 24 hours ago, my father had threatened to destroy my company and send me to a federal prison. Now my mother Patricia was formally inviting me to carve the turkey. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a peace offering. This was a highly calculated pivot from open warfare to emotional manipulation. Patricia was the unquestioned architect of this new strategy. She had always been the quiet enforcer of the family dynamic, preferring psychological pressure over my father's blunt aggression. They had realized that threats would not work against a bank that held the deed to their home. So they were falling back on the one arena where they believed they still held absolute power over me. Family tradition. The Atherton estate. Thanksgiving was never just a meal. It was a carefully staged theatrical production involving dozens of extended relatives, family friends, and business associates. Growing up, I was always seated at the far end of the table, a prop to be ignored, while Madison was paraded around like a prize-winning racehorse. Now they intended to use that exact same audience against me. They wanted to trap me in a room full of aunts, uncles, and cousins. They planned to corner me past the mashed potatoes and leverage the sheer weight of familial expectation to force my hand. They genuinely believed that if Patricia cried and my father looked sufficiently humbled in front of an audience, I would simply crumble. They thought the social pressure of the holiday would shame me into signing away the $500,000 debt and handing Kendrick his building back just to keep the peace. Marcus stepped into my office holding a fresh stack of foreclosure documents. I slid the gold foil invitation across the polished mahogany desk. He picked it up, reading the elegant script with a deep frown. "Tell me you are throwing this directly into the shredder," Marcus said, dropping the invitation back onto my desk. "This is a blatant trap, Cassidy. They know they have absolutely zero legal leverage. They know you hold the debt on the Atherton property, and they know Kendrick is running a fraudulent operation. They want to get you into a room filled with people and emotionally blackmail you into voiding the home equity line of credit." I leaned back in my leather chair, studying the invitation. "I know it is a trap, Marcus. Patricia thinks she can isolate me in the dining room and play the victim card. She thinks she can tell the extended family that I am a ruthless billionaire trying to render my own parents homeless for the holidays." "Then stay away," Marcus advised, his voice taking on his strict attorney tone. "Do not engage with them on their territory. We have the upper hand here. We can execute the foreclosure legally, quietly, and efficiently through the corporate channels. You do not need to subject yourself to their psychological games. Let Apex Financial handle the default. If you go to that house, you are giving them the opportunity to manipulate the narrative again." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I had spent my entire life avoiding their traps, backing down to keep the peace, and absorbing their abuse in silence. I remembered the night I was kicked out of that very same Atherton estate. I remembered begging my father not to ruin his finances for Madison's wedding, only to be called a worthless liability and thrown into the rain. I had spent years building an impenetrable fortress of wealth and security, so I would never have to feel that small again. But simply ignoring them felt like running away. "I am not hiding behind Apex Financial," I said, my voice utterly calm. "If I let the corporate attorneys handle this, they will spin it as a misunderstanding. Madison will play the victim. Kendrick will find another mark. My parents will paint me as a monster to the entire extended family and continue living in their delusion." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "Cassidy, what exactly are you planning to do?" I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored suit. "I need you and Elena to compile everything we found last night," I instructed. "I want the shell company filings. I want the wire transfer receipts linking my father's retirement accounts to Kendrick's fake startup. I want the property deed for the Pacific Heights luxury condo registered to Mia Thorne. And I want the medical billing records from the Beverly Hills maternity clinic proving she is 6 months pregnant with Kendrick's child." I tapped the gold foil invitation on my desk. "Put every single piece of that evidence into a single physical file. I want it printed, verified, and tabbed. Prepare the red folder. Marcus looked at me, a slow realization dawning in his eyes. You are actually going to that dinner? Yes, I said, picking up the invitation and slipping it into my bag. They want to use the family to pressure me into saving their house, but they forgot that I am the one holding all the cards now. I am going to Thanksgiving, and I am bringing the executioner's axe. The black Maybach glided smoothly through the towering wrought iron gates of the Atherton estate. The heavy tires crunched in a slow, rhythmic cadence against the pristine white gravel of the sweeping driveway. I sat in the spacious rear cabin, resting my hand on the thick red leather folder, seated squarely on my lap. Marcus sat beside me, his face an unreadable mask of corporate stoicism. He had vehemently advised me not to come. He had warned me that walking into their territory was a severe tactical mistake. But this was no longer a simple matter of corporate leverage or foreclosure protocols. This was about exorcising ghosts. The vehicle rolled to a seamless stop in front of the grand portico. My driver opened the door, and the crisp, sharp bite of the November air hit my face. I stepped out, clutching the red folder tight against my side, and walked up the wide brick steps. The heavy oak front doors swung open before I could even reach for the polished brass knocker. My mother stood in the threshold. Patricia was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater set that likely cost more than my first car. Her face broke into a massive, perfectly practiced smile of utter delight. She practically lunged forward, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating, theatrical embrace. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming, masking the sheer desperation radiating from her rigid posture. "Cassidy, darling, you look absolutely stunning," my mother gushed, pulling back to examine my tailored charcoal suit. "We are just so incredibly thrilled you decided to join us today. Come in, it is freezing out there." I stepped over the threshold and walked into the cavernous grand foyer. The house smelled intensely of roasted turkey sage stuffing and burning hickory wood from the massive stone fireplace. It was the absolute picture of upper-class domestic bliss. It was flawless. It was sickening. Madison drifted out of the formal dining room holding a crystal wine glass. She was wearing a silk burgundy dress, her hair styled in effortless cascading waves. She smiled brightly, her eyes completely devoid of warmth, and handed me a freshly poured glass of vintage Pinot Noir. "Happy Thanksgiving, Cassie." Madison chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It has been way too long. We really missed you." I took the glass from her manicured hand, staring down at the dark red liquid. I looked past her, down at the imported Persian rug beneath our feet. The hypocritical warmth in the room was so thick it was suffocating. The last time I had stood on this exact rug, I was not holding a glass of vintage wine. I was shivering violently in a cheap thin wool coat that was soaked entirely through with freezing rain. I had begged them, crying, for just 1 week to sleep in the guest room while I searched for a cheap apartment. I had zero money and absolutely nowhere to go. I looked at Madison, remembering exactly how she had stood on the grand curved staircase that night, wrapped in her custom-imported wedding gown, complaining loudly to our mother. Madison had literally rolled her eyes and whined that my crying was ruining her pre-wedding vibe. She had demanded that Thomas get me out of her sight, and he did without a second thought. I took a slow, measured sip of the wine. "Thank you, Madison," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any reciprocal emotion. "It is certainly a day for giving thanks." I walked past them and entered the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set for a massive feast. Heavy silver cutlery gleamed under the brilliant light of the crystal chandelier. Kendrick was already seated near the middle of the table. He was wearing a sharp navy blazer, desperately trying to project the image of a wildly successful tech founder. But I could see the fine sheen of panic sweat glistening on his forehead. He swallowed hard when I caught his eye, but managed to force a weak, tight smile. I took my seat at the far opposite end of the table, directly facing the head chair where my father always sat. Thomas entered the room a moment later, carrying the massive roasted turkey on a heavy silver platter. He set it down in the center of the table with a theatrical flourish. He looked directly at me and gave a broad, welcoming grin that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Cassidy," he boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "It is wonderful to have the whole family together again. Just like old times." I placed the red folder gently on the table, resting it right next to my crystal water glass. I watched as my father's eyes darted toward the leather binding for a fraction of a second before he quickly looked away. The meal began with a highly synchronized performance of fake harmony. Patricia passed the mashed potatoes while talking animatedly about the country club's upcoming winter charity gala. Madison casually mentioned a new, highly sought-after interior designer she was hiring to renovate their living room. Kendrick chimed in with a completely fabricated story about a recent software conference he had supposedly attended in Seattle. It was a masterclass in collective delusion. They were completely ignoring the financial guillotine hovering inches above their necks, acting as if the morning's explosive phone call had never happened. As the dinner plates were finally being cleared, my father stood up. He picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it gently against his crystal wine glass. The clear, ringing sound silenced the room immediately. Patricia folded her hands gracefully in her lap, looking up at him with practiced devotion. Madison and Kendrick turned their undivided attention to the head of the table. "Family." Thomas began, his voice taking on a deep, resonant tone of manufactured wisdom and paternal grace. "Family is the absolute foundation of everything we build in this life. We may have our disagreements, we may have our temporary misunderstandings, but at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. We must always protect our own. We must forgive past grievances and move forward together in unity." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored sports coat. He pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He walked slowly, purposefully down the length of the long mahogany table. He stopped right beside the remains of the carved turkey directly in front of me. "Cassidy," he said, his voice dropping to a sickeningly sweet pitch of desperate paternal affection, "we want to put all this ugly business behind us. We want to welcome you back into the fold permanently. We are family, and family takes care of each other." He slid the legal contract across the polished wood. It glided past the turkey platter and came to a stop right next to my red folder. I glanced down at the bold printed heading. It was a comprehensive debt forgiveness agreement and a permanent rent waiver for Kendrick's commercial lease. "All you have to do is sign that paper, Cassidy," my father said, pulling a heavy gold-plated luxury pen from his pocket and offering it to me. "Sign the paper, and we can go back to being a happy family." I looked down at the heavy gold-plated pen resting on top of the dense legal document. The ink cartridge was extended and ready. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of the hickory wood burning in the grand fireplace 2 rooms over. My father stood there with his hand outstretched, his chest puffed out in a posture of magnanimous forgiveness. He truly believed he was offering me a gift. He believed that allowing me the privilege of absorbing his catastrophic $500,000 mistake was an honor I should accept with gratitude. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I placed my index finger against the edge of the thick paper. I applied a fraction of pressure and slowly, deliberately pushed the contract back across the polished mahogany surface. The document glided smoothly over the expensive wood, coming to a dead stop right next to the silver platter holding the carved turkey. "I don't mix turkey with toxic assets, Dad," I said. My voice was perfectly level, stripped of any anger, resentment, or fear. It was the exact same tone I used when dismantling hostile takeover bids in corporate boardrooms. The fake, suffocating warmth that had blanketed the dining room evaporated in an instant. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father's outstretched hand slowly curled into a tight, trembling fist. The sickeningly sweet smile froze on his face, morphing into a mask of stunned, rigid fury. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of my refusal. He had meticulously orchestrated this entire evening. He had set the stage, assembled the players, and delivered his lines flawlessly. My compliance was supposed to be guaranteed, but it was my mother who broke first. Patricia had spent the last hour playing the role of the graceful, benevolent matriarch. She had passed the side dishes with elegant flourishes and offered practiced hollow compliments. When the contract slid back across the table, her pristine facade cracked and then shattered entirely. The quiet psychological enforcer of the family dynamic was suddenly confronted with a reality she could not manipulate. Her hands flew up from her lap. She grabbed the stem of her crystal wine glass with a white-knuckled grip. Without a single word of warning, Patricia yanked her arm back and hurled the glass violently across the room. The heavy crystals smashed against the custom-imported floral wallpaper. The sound of the impact was deafening, a sharp, violent crash that echoed off the high ceilings. Shards of glittering glass rained down onto the hardwood floor. Dark vintage Pinot Noir splattered violently against the wall, dripping down the expensive floral print like thick running blood. Madison shrieked, pushing her chair back so fast it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. She covered her face, horrified that her perfect holiday aesthetic had just erupted into sudden physical violence. "You cold-blooded sociopath," Patricia screamed. Her voice was utterly unrecognizable. It was raw, guttural, and vibrating with an unhinged feral entitlement. She stepped away from the table, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "We gave you life!" she shrieked, her chest heaving as she lost all semblance of upper-class decorum. "We put a roof over your head. We raised you in this house. You have hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in your bank accounts, and you are going to throw your own parents on the street over a piece of paper. You are going to render your own family homeless on Thanksgiving because you are too bitter and too selfish to help us." I remained perfectly seated in my chair. I did not flinch when the glass shattered. I did not raise my voice. I reached forward, picked up my crystal water goblet, and took a slow, measured sip. I set the glass back down on the table, watching the dark red wine continue to run down the ruined wallpaper. The contrast between us was absolute. They were frantic, sweating and screaming. They were drowning in the consequences of their own reckless greed. I was an anchor of cold, calculated control. "You kicked me out of this house into the freezing rain over a catering bill for a wedding. I told you not to fund," I said softly. "You told me I was a liability. You told me I was a failure. You did not care if I ended up on the street. Do not stand there and lecture me about the sanctity of family housing when you only care about this roof because it is currently over your own head. You owe us!" my father bellowed, finally finding his voice. He slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, making the silverware rattle violently against the china. "You will sign that debt forgiveness contract right now, Cassidy. You will not leave this room until that debt is cleared." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The intimidation tactics that used to terrify me when I was a teenager now felt pathetic and small. They were just desperate people screaming at a storm they could not stop. "I will not sign away a $500,000 debt because you threw a piece of glassware, Patricia," I said, shifting my gaze back to my mother. "And I will certainly not forgive a commercial loan that was explicitly designed to cover up Kendrick's corporate fraud." At the mention of his name, the dynamic in the room shifted again. Kendrick had been sitting quietly through the screaming match, watching his carefully constructed house of cards begin to buckle. But as my parents descended into panicked, ineffective rage, something changed in his posture. The nervous sweat on his forehead seemed to dry. The panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, arrogant certainty. He watched my mother preparing to launch into another screaming tirade about my lack of loyalty. Kendrick pushed his heavy dining chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the floor, drawing everyone's attention. He stood up slowly, squaring his shoulders. He reached for the center button of his tailored navy suit jacket and unbuttoned it with a deliberate theatrical slowness. "Don't beg her," Patricia Kendrick commanded. His voice sliced through the tension in the room, smooth and dripping with extreme, unwarranted arrogance. My mother stopped mid-breath, turning to look at her son-in-law in confusion. Madison stared up at her husband, her eyes wide with desperate hope. Kendrick rounded the edge of the table, stepping over the spilled wine and shattered crystal. He looked down the length of the mahogany table directly at me. His lips curled upward into a vicious, victorious sneer. "We don't need her charity," he stated, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute defiance. Kendrick buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with the exaggerated precision of a man who believed he had just won a war. He walked slowly around the shattered glass and the pooling red wine, coming to stand directly at the head of the table next to my father. Thomas looked up at him, the desperate panic in his eyes momentarily replaced by a flicker of confused hope. Patricia stopped her theatrical hyperventilating, wiping a stray tear from her perfectly powdered cheek. The heavy metallic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to echo louder in the sudden quiet. "You really thought you could walk into this house and hold us hostage?" Cassidy Kendrick said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought you could just buy up the family debt and play the ruthless corporate executioner. It was a cute strategy, very aggressive, very Silicon Valley. But you made one massive miscalculation. You underestimated my legal counsel." I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching him strut. He was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. The massive roasted turkey sat between us, the smell of sage and butter suddenly nauseating in the heavy, tense air of the dining room. The red folder sat perfectly still beside my water glass, an unopened vault of absolute destruction. "Did you honestly think a multi-million-dollar software venture operates without top-tier legal representation?" He continued, leaning his palms flat against the mahogany table. "While you were busy printing out that dramatic red folder and practicing your villain monologue, my attorneys were actively dismantling your entire offensive strategy. We spent the last 12 hours conducting a forensic review of the home equity line of credit Thomas signed with your shell company. And guess what we found, Cassidy?" He paused, clearly waiting for me to ask, waiting for the fear to register on my face. When I offered absolutely no reaction, his sneer deepened. "We found a massive, glaring loophole," Kendrick announced, his voice booming through the dining room. "Your predatory lending terms are in direct violation of California state consumer protection laws. The interest rate acceleration clause you buried in page 42 of the master agreement breaches the maximum allowable threshold for residential equity loans. It is illegal. It is completely unenforceable. My legal team drafted an emergency injunction early this morning and filed it with the state court. A judge signed off on it an hour ago. You cannot foreclose on this estate. You cannot collect a single dime of that debt until the State Banking Commission conducts a full comprehensive review of your fraudulent lending practices." Thomas let out a loud, shuddering breath, slumping back into his chair, as if the weight of the world had just been lifted off his chest. Patricia clasped her hands together, looking at Kendrick as if he were a divine savior sent to deliver them from evil. "You are finished, Cassidy," my father said, a cruel, vindictive smile spreading across his face. "You tried to destroy your own blood and you trapped yourself instead." Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of their legal theory, Madison pushed her chair back and stood up. She walked over to stand beside her husband, slipping her arm through his. She looked down at me with the exact same expression of petty, victorious malice she used to wear when we were children, whenever she successfully blamed me for something she had broken. I looked at her, noting the absolute staggering hypocrisy of the moment. The last time I had stood in this exact dining room, I was not sitting at a mahogany table being served vintage wine. I was standing near the archway, shivering violently in a wet coat, begging for just 1 week to crash on the couch so I could find a cheap apartment. My father had just drained my college fund to pay for Madison's extravagant wedding catering bill. Madison had been standing right where she was now, sipping champagne, complaining loudly to our mother that my crying was ruining her pre-wedding vibe. She had told me to leave because my negativity was toxic to her bridal energy. Now she was playing the fiercely loyal sister, defending the sanctity of the family home she had gladly watched me get thrown out of. "And that is not even the best part," Cassie Madison chimed in, her voice bright and venomous. "You remember that little viral video I posted yesterday? The one exposing you for the heartless, eviction-obsessed monster you really are. I know you saw that Kendrick took it down this morning. You probably thought you intimidated us into deleting it. You probably thought your little phone call to Dad actually worked." She picked up her wine glass and took a celebratory sip, locking her eyes onto mine. The sweet aroma of the wine clashed harshly with the bitter reality of the room. "We did not delete it," Madison stated, her smile widening into a triumphant grin. "We simply moved it off the public feed to use as leverage. If you even try to fight this injunction, if you send a single lawyer after this family, I am sending the original unedited video file directly to my contacts at the New York Times. I will tell them exactly who you are. I will frame the entire narrative around your illegal lending practices. I will tell the world how the great Cassidy Wilson built her tech empire by operating a predatory shadow bank that preys on innocent families. I will make sure the state authorities launch a full investigation into CW Holdings. Your investors will flee. Your board will fire you. We have you entirely checkmated. I sat there in the sudden ringing silence of the dining room. I looked at the four of them. They were standing together, a united front of absolute staggering delusion. They had convinced themselves that they had outmaneuvered me. They believed that a hastily drafted injunction and a social media video were enough to tear down an empire I had spent years fortifying against corporate predators, far more terrifying than a failed software developer and an Instagram model. I looked at Kendrick, noting the expensive cut of his suit. I wondered briefly how much of my father's stolen retirement money had gone to retaining that supposed top-tier legal team he was bragging about. He was standing there radiating arrogant superiority, completely oblivious to the radioactive reality of his own life. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he had shielded the family and secured his free ride. I reached for the crisp white linen napkin resting beside my plate. I picked it up with slow, deliberate grace and elegantly wiped the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin perfectly in half and placed it back on the mahogany table, smoothing out the fabric. I looked down at my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my charcoal suit jacket to check the face of my watch. It was exactly 2 minutes past the hour. Perfect timing. A loophole, I asked, finally breaking the silence. My voice was calm, conversational, carrying not a single trace of the panic they were so desperately waiting to see. I let a soft, genuine laugh escape my lips. "Kendrick, you forgot the golden rule of business," I said, locking my eyes onto his. "Never threaten the person who holds your leash." Kendrick's arrogant sneer faltered for a fraction of a second. Madison frowned, her grip tightening on his arm. "Madison," I continued, shifting my gaze to my sister, my tone perfectly pleasant. "You might want to go ahead and open the front door. Your husband's VIP guests are here." Right on cue, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the grand foyer, ringing out like a judge's gavel striking wood. The heavy brass knocker echoed a second time, shattering the stunned silence of the dining room. My father blinked, shaking his head, to dislodge the confusion my warning had planted. He looked at the grandfather clock, then toward the grand foyer. "That will be Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Robert," Thomas muttered, his voice lacking its commanding boom. He hurried toward the entryway to escape the tension. "They are early. Let me handle this. Do not say another word, Cassidy." Patricia remained frozen near the shattered crystal, her chest heaving. Madison glared at me, arms crossed tightly. Kendrick went rigid. His eyes darted from my perfectly calm expression to the red folder resting by my glass, his mind desperately calculating what variable he had missed. From the foyer, the sound of the oak door swinging open was followed by my father's breathless stammer. "Excuse me, who are you?" "This is a private residence," Thomas demanded, his tone offended. "We are in the middle of a family dinner." "Thomas Atherton," a deep, authoritative voice responded. It carried no warmth, only the flat tone of law enforcement. "Step back, please. We need to speak with Kendrick Vance." Madison's triumphant sneer vanished. She dropped Kendrick's arm and stepped into the hallway, her silk dress swishing around her ankles. She marched toward the door. I remained in my chair, savoring the destruction of their reality. Then I picked up the red folder and followed her. When I reached the archway of the foyer, the scene unfolding was a masterpiece of shattered illusions. My father was backed against the curved staircase, his face pale. Standing on the Persian rug was a young woman in a beige maternity dress that hugged her pregnant belly. She looked exhausted, terrified, clutching a small leather purse to her chest like a shield. This was Mia Thorne. Behind Mia stood two tall men in dark suits. They completely ignored my father's spluttering outrage. The lead agent reached into his breast pocket and smoothly produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold shield. "Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division," the man stated, his eyes locked onto the archway. "We have a federal warrant for the search of these premises and the immediate detainment of Kendrick Vance." Madison froze in her tracks. Her eyes darted wildly between the badge, the agents, and the pregnant woman. She spun around, looking back into the dining room. Kendrick had stumbled out from behind the mahogany table. The arrogant, untouchable tech founder was completely gone. His tailored blazer looked 2 sizes too big. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took a stumbling step backward, his shoulder hitting the edge of the dining room wall. Short, ragged gasps of air rattled in his chest. His hands shook violently as he reached up to loosen his silk tie, suddenly unable to breathe in the suffocating reality of his actions catching up to him. He looked at Mia, and a pathetic whimper escaped his throat. "Kendrick!" Madison demanded, her voice shrill and trembling with sudden panic. "Kendrick, what is going on? Who are these people? Why is the FBI in my parents' house?" She turned her furious gaze toward the young woman marching aggressively forward. "And who the hell are you? Did Cassidy hire you to come here and stage this pathetic little stunt?" Mia flinched, taking a quick step back toward Agent Miller. She looked past Madison, her tear-filled eyes landing squarely on Kendrick, who was now clutching his chest and sliding slowly down the floral wallpaper. "I'm sorry, Kendrick," Mia sobbed, her voice echoing in the grand foyer. "They showed up at the Pacific Heights condo this morning. They knew everything about the shell companies. They had the wire transfers. I had to tell them where you were. I couldn't go to federal prison, not with the baby coming." "Baby?" Patricia gasped, stepping out from the dining room, her pristine cashmere sweater spotted with drops of spilled wine. She grabbed the edge of the doorframe for support, looking completely unmoored. "What condo? What baby?" Agent Miller stepped forward, his expression remaining entirely neutral. "Kendrick Vance, you are being detained in connection with federal wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and the operation of an unregistered financial shell corporation. We have already frozen the accounts associated with your startup." Madison let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Wire fraud, a shell corporation? No, you have this completely wrong. My husband runs a legitimate multi-million-dollar software company. He just secured a massive round of Series A funding. He is a tech innovator. You are making a massive mistake." I adjusted my grip on the red folder and walked deliberately into the grand foyer. I moved past my sputtering father and stepped right beside Madison, my presence commanding the absolute silence of the room. The federal agents looked at me, recognizing the person whose corporate attorneys had handed them this case wrapped in a bow. I turned to face my sister, my expression entirely devoid of pity. I looked down at her shaking hands, then up into her terrified, uncomprehending eyes. "A loophole will not save you from a federal indictment, Madison," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceiling of the grand entryway. "Your husband never had a software company. He never had a tech product. He never attended a conference in Seattle, and he certainly never secured a single dime of legitimate venture capital." I raised the red folder, tapping it gently against my side. "He took Dad's entire retirement fund, funneled it through a fake corporate entity, and used it to purchase a luxury Pacific Heights condo for his actual priorities." I turned slightly, gesturing gracefully toward the terrified pregnant woman standing on the Persian rug. "Madison, allow me to introduce Kendrick's Series A funding," I announced calmly. "Meet his mistress and her unborn child." Madison's gaze dropped from Mia's terrified, tear-streaked face to the unmistakable swell of her pregnant belly. The pristine, highly curated reality Madison had built her entire identity around fractured with a deafening crack. For one suspended heartbeat, the grand foyer was dead silent. Then the dam broke. Madison unleashed a sound that was half shriek and half animalistic wail. She lunged forward, her expensive silk dress tearing at the seam as she threw herself across the Persian rug. Her manicured hands turned into claws aimed directly at Kendrick's face. Her fingernails caught the side of his neck, dragging a jagged, bright red line across his skin before he managed to grab her wrists. He shoved her backward with brute force, sending her stumbling into the mahogany console table. A heavy porcelain vase crashed to the floor, shattering into 100 jagged pieces that scattered across the entryway. Patricia screamed for Madison to stop rushing forward, but freezing instantly as Agent Miller held up a firm, commanding hand. The federal agents remained rooted in place, watching the violent unraveling of the Atherton family with the cold, practiced detachment of men who executed these kinds of warrants every single day. They were not there to play referee to domestic meltdowns. They were there to make an arrest. I stood perfectly still at the edge of the dining room, watching the chaos with absolute clinical precision. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through Madison's hysterical sobbing and Patricia's frantic gasps like a finely sharpened blade. My father slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were completely vacant. The proud, imposing patriarch who had bullied me my entire life was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, trembling shell of a man. "That $500,000 you mortgaged this entire estate for?" I continued, speaking slowly so every single syllable registered in his mind. "The money you drained from your retirement accounts to fund Kendrick's brilliant tech startup. He didn't build software. He didn't hire developers. He bought her a luxury penthouse in downtown Pacific Heights." Thomas slowly turned his head back to Kendrick. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Mia pulled her small leather purse tighter against her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. She looked at Madison, tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her carefully applied makeup. "He told me he was single," Mia sobbed, her voice trembling violently under the intense glare of the entire room. "He told me he was a tech billionaire who had just sold his first major software company. We were supposed to leave tomorrow morning. He had first-class tickets printed and packed. He said we were moving to Dubai to start our new family away from the California state taxes." Dubai. The word hung in the air like a physical weight. Kendrick had never planned to fight the foreclosure. He had never planned to negotiate a settlement. He had been planning to take my father's stolen money and flee the country entirely, leaving Madison and my parents to face the financial firing squad alone. Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet tension of the foyer. "Kendrick Vance," Agent Miller stated, his voice projecting absolute authority over the weeping women and the stunned patriarch. "We are here to execute a federal arrest warrant. You are being charged with 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of international embezzlement, and fleeing the jurisdiction of a federal subpoena." The realization finally hit my father. The thick legal document sitting on the dining room table was completely useless. The aggressive legal loophole was a total fabrication. The money was gone. The house was gone. He had signed away his legacy, his home, and his financial future for a phantom company, and the architect of his absolute ruin was standing right in his foyer wearing a custom-tailored suit. Thomas let out a guttural roar. It was a sound of absolute, bottomless despair tearing out of his throat, with enough force to make the crystal chandelier above us vibrate. He lunged past Patricia, closing the distance between himself and his son-in-law in 2 massive strides. He grabbed Kendrick by the lapels of his expensive navy blazer and slammed him violently against the wall. The impact rattled the framed oil paintings hanging along the staircase. Kendrick gasped for air, his head knocking hard against the thick wooden wainscoting. "My house!" Thomas roared, spit flying from his lips, as he shook the younger man with terrifying adrenaline-fueled strength. "I lost my house for you. I signed away my entire life." Kendrick struggled uselessly against my father's grip. His lips split open from the impact, sending a thick stream of dark blood down his chin and onto his crisp white dress shirt. Madison shrieked, backing away from the violent display and pressing her hands over her ears. Patricia stood paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Agent Miller and his partner moved forward quickly to pry my father off the bleeding suspect. But before the federal agents could secure Kendrick's wrists, Kendrick tilted his head back and screamed. "It wasn't my idea!" Kendrick shrieked, his voice cracking under the intense physical pressure of my father's grip. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes wide and filled with the manic, pathetic desperation of a cornered rat realizing there was no escape. He spat blood onto the polished hardwood floor, gasping for air, as the FBI agents finally managed to pull Thomas away. "I didn't forge the financial documents," Kendrick yelled, wiping the blood from his mouth with a shaking hand. I didn't bypass the Apex financial security checks. I didn't know how to route the money offshore without triggering the federal tax flags. I am just the face of the company. Thomas froze, the furious red flush leaving his face as the words registered. Madison lowered her hands, staring at her husband in utter confusion. I stood perfectly still, watching the final piece of the puzzle slide brutally into place. Kendrick raised a trembling, blood-stained finger and pointed it directly across the foyer. He bypassed Thomas. He bypassed Madison. He aimed his finger directly at Patricia. She did it! Kendrick screamed, his voice echoing into the sudden freezing silence of the room. Patricia set up the shell company. Patricia showed me how to steal the money. The echo of Kendrick's accusation hung in the freezing air of the grand foyer. My father slowly released his grip on Kendrick's collar. He turned his massive frame toward my mother. Patricia was backed against the arched entryway of the dining room. Her hands were trembling violently as she clutched the fabric of her ruined cashmere sweater. The quiet architect of our family's psychological warfare was suddenly exposed under the harsh fluorescent glare of a federal investigation. Patricia shook her head frantically. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a high, thin wheeze escaped her throat. Kendrick spat another mouthful of blood onto the Persian rug. He leaned back against the wainscoting, laughing a manic, unhinged sound that made the FBI agents tense. He was going down, and he was utterly determined to drag the entire Atherton legacy into the flames with him. "She told me how to do it," Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "She came to me 6 months ago crying about the country club dues and the property taxes. She knew your retirement accounts were vulnerable, Thomas. She gave me the account numbers. She authorized the initial transfers to cover her credit card debts. She thought she could just take a little off the top to maintain appearances." My father looked like a man who had just been shot. The color drained completely from his face, leaving a mottled, sickly gray in its wake. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the mahogany console table. He looked at his wife of nearly 40 years, and then back at the bleeding software developer who had systematically dismantled his life. "At least we have the house." Thomas breathed out, his voice a hollow, rattling sound. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady his trembling legs. "At least we have the estate. We can sell the house. We can hire lawyers. We can fight this." Kendrick threw his head back against the wall. His bloody laugh escalated into a shriek of pure, deranged mockery. "The house," Kendrick screamed. "The house is gone anyway. You were already broke, Thomas. You were bleeding cash for years trying to keep up this pathetic billionaire facade. I just accelerated the process." Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling Kendrick away from the wall by his bicep. Kendrick thrashed against the federal agent, desperate to deliver his final lethal blow. "I forged your signature!" Thomas Kendrick shrieked, spittle flying from his bloody lips. "I took out a second mortgage on this entire estate 3 months ago. Every single brick of this house belongs to the bank. I needed the cash. I had offshore gambling debts. I lost it all on margin calls and underground tables. The HELOC was just a band-aid. You have absolutely nothing left. You are completely bankrupt." The words struck the foyer with the devastating force of a physical bomb. Total, absolute chaos erupted. Madison let out a blood-curdling scream. The pristine golden child, who had spent her entire existence floating on a cloud of unearned privilege, suddenly realized her parachute had just been slashed. She lunged across the foyer, her manicured hands hooked into claws. She threw herself at Kendrick, screaming hysterically, tearing at his ruined suit jacket, until the second FBI agent caught her around the waist and hauled her backward. Madison kicked and thrashed her expensive silk dress, ripping further as she wailed in pure, untethered agony. Her perfect life was a complete hallucination. Her tech-genius husband was a broke gambling addict facing federal prison. He was cheating on her. He had a pregnant mistress standing mere feet away. He had decimated her family. Patricia stared at her daughter thrashing in the arms of a federal agent. She stared at the pregnant woman crying quietly by the door. She stared at the blood on her beautiful Persian rug. The absolute destruction of her carefully curated upper-class facade was complete. The crushing weight of her own complicity, combined with the revelation of total financial ruin, hit her all at once. Patricia let out a short, sharp gasp. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She collapsed straight backward, hitting the hardwood floor of the dining room with a heavy, sickening thud. She fainted dead away, landing right next to the shattered crystal and the pooling red wine. Nobody moved to help her. The foyer smelled of expensive perfume, copper blood, and the sharp tang of fear. Mia, the pregnant mistress, stood trembling by the door, her hands protectively shielding her belly. She watched the family she had almost been tricked into joining tear itself apart. Agent Miller motioned for his partner to walk Kendrick out the front door. Kendrick stumbled over the threshold, his head hanging low, a disgraced criminal being marched out of the fortress he had destroyed. Madison dropped to her knees on the floor, sobbing violently into her hands. The wailing sound she made was guttural and raw. Her perfect cascading waves of hair were tangled and plastered to her wet face. The sound of her weeping filled the cavernous space, a pathetic symphony of shattered entitlement. I stood near the archway, perfectly composed. I smoothed the lapel of my charcoal suit. The contrast between my calm silence and their unhinged destruction was absolute. For 30 years they had treated me like a worthless liability. They had kicked me out into the freezing rain to protect their wealth. Now they were drowning in a swamp of their own making. My father stood frozen by the console table. He looked at his unconscious wife. He looked at his wailing golden child. He looked at the empty doorway where his son-in-law had just been hauled away in steel handcuffs. Thomas was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in short, rapid spasms. The reality of his bankruptcy was suffocating him. He had lost everything. He was completely destitute. Then Thomas turned his head. His wild, desperate eyes locked onto me. He saw me standing there in my immaculate tailored suit, the daughter he had thrown away, the billionaire he had tried to emotionally blackmail just 10 minutes ago. He took a step toward me, his hands clasping together in a pleading gesture I had never seen him use in my entire life. The man who had sneered at my tears was now begging for his survival. Cassidy. Thomas gasped, his voice cracking as he scrambled toward me. He reached out his hands, shaking violently. Cassidy. Please. The injunction. Kendrick said he filed an injunction against your bank. We can use it. We can fight the second mortgage. You have the best corporate lawyers in the state. You have to help me fight the bank. You have to save the house. I looked at my father's trembling, outstretched hands. I looked into his terrified, begging eyes. He was actually asking me to save him. I reached down into my designer leather bag resting on the dining chair beside me. I slid my hand inside and pulled out the thick, bright red folder. I gripped the heavy cardstock of the red folder, feeling the smooth texture against my fingertips. The weight of it was substantial, a physical manifestation of absolute, undeniable truth. My father stood before me in the grand foyer, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from his violent outburst. He was waiting for me to throw him a lifeline, expecting me to leverage the vast resources of my company to save him from the consequences of his own arrogance. He looked at me, not as a daughter, but as a utility, a sudden asset he could exploit to clean up the catastrophic mess Kendrick had left behind. I stepped past him, leaving him standing near the Persian rug with his outstretched, shaking hands. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor as I walked deliberately back into the dining room. The space was a battlefield of upper-class ruin. Patricia remained unconscious on the floor, her breathing shallow, her pristine hair soaked in spilled vintage Merlot. Madison was still slumped against the wainscoting, her hysterical wailing having devolved into wet, pathetic hiccups. The remnants of our lavish Thanksgiving feast sat entirely ignored on the mahogany table, the roasted turkey growing cold. The expensive crystal shattered the illusion of the Atherton dynasty, completely shattered alongside it. Thomas scrambled after me, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished floorboards. He grabbed the back of his dining chair to steady himself, his eyes locked onto the folder in my hands. The desperation radiating from him was palpable, a suffocating aura of fear that had entirely replaced his usual overbearing superiority. I stopped at the head of the table, the exact seat my father had proudly occupied for 30 years, while dictating the strict terms of my worth. I held the red folder suspended over the polished wood for a fraction of a second, letting the silence in the room stretch until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our chests. Then, with a smooth flick of my wrist, I let it drop. The heavy folder hit the mahogany surface with a resounding smack. The sharp sound made my father flinch. "There is no injunction, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level, slicing through the heavy tension of the dining room. Kendrick did not hire top-tier legal counsel. He did not file emergency motions with the state court. He did not draft a brilliant strategy to delay the inevitable. He simply lied to your face to buy himself enough time to pack his bags and flee to Dubai with his pregnant mistress. Thomas stared at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He shook his head frantically, rejecting the reality I was handing to him. "No, no, that cannot be right," he stammered, his voice breathless and frantic. "The bank has to negotiate. I am Thomas Atherton. We have lived in this estate for decades. I have equity. I have standing. You have to call your corporate lawyers Cassidy. We can tie them up in litigation. We can fight the bank." I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity. The man who had drained my college fund to pay for Madison's extravagant wedding catering, the man who had thrown me out into the rain without a second thought, was now expecting me to wage a corporate legal war on his behalf. "And there is no bank left to fight." I continued delivering the words with surgical precision. Thomas froze. His eyes darted from the red folder to my face, the frantic energy drained out of him, replaced by a deep, terrifying confusion. "What do you mean?" He rasped, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the back of the dining chair. "What do you mean there is no bank left?" I reached out and flipped open the cover of the red folder. Inside sat a pristine stack of official county documents stamped notarized and entirely irrevocable. "The financial reality of your situation is completely terminal," I stated, tapping my manicured fingernail against the top document. "Both your initial home equity line of credit and the fraudulent second mortgage Kendrick took out went 120 days past due. You missed every single payment. The bank sent default notices, warning letters, and acceleration demands. Patricia intercepted the mail to hide the initial deficit, and Kendrick likely destroyed the rest to cover his tracks." Madison stopped hiccuping. She slowly pulled herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the doorframe, her tear-streaked face pale with dawning horror. She was finally listening, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the disaster her perfect husband had orchestrated. The 90-day pre-foreclosure grace period, mandated by state law, ended 3 weeks ago. I explained, my tone strictly instructional, as if I were delivering a quarterly earnings report to my board of directors. "Because you filed no formal response, offered no repayment plan, and ignored every legal summons, the bank moved forward with the standard default protocol. They did not want your house, Dad. They wanted their money, so they liquidated the asset to recover their losses." Thomas swayed on his feet. He looked down at the documents in the folder, his eyes tracing the bold black ink of the official county seals. He was a businessman. He understood exactly what those terms meant. He understood the brutal finality of the process. "The foreclosure auction took place yesterday morning at the county courthouse," I said, delivering the ultimate crushing financial truth. "The bank put the deed to this entire estate up for public bidding. The property was sold. The transaction was finalized, the funds were cleared, and the title was officially transferred at exactly 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. You do not own this house anymore. You have absolutely no legal standing to remain on these premises." Thomas stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. His imposing stature seemed to collapse inward, shrinking him down into a frail, broken old man. The reality of his absolute poverty had finally penetrated his thick armor of arrogance. He had no retirement. He had no savings. He had no home. He had been completely ruined by his own blind favoritism and toxic pride. His knees buckled. He fell heavily into the dining chair, the mahogany wood groaning under his sudden weight. He slumped forward, his hands resting limply on the table right next to the red folder. His breathing was ragged, shallow, catching in his throat like shards of broken glass. He looked around the opulent dining room at the expensive oil paintings, the custom drapery, the life he had so viciously protected and so easily lost. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any remaining fight or superiority. He looked at me, a single tear spilling over his lower lash line and tracing a wet path down his weathered cheek. "Who?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. He swallowed hard, struggling to push the words past the terror tightening his throat. "Who bought it?" I looked down at the man who had called me a failure, the man who had gladly watched his golden child strip me of everything I had ever owned. I let a slow, terrifyingly serene smile spread across my face. My eyes turned absolutely ice cold. I did. The silence in the dining room became absolute. I watched the comprehension slowly map itself across my father's weathered face. The man who had spent his entire life valuing people solely by their financial leverage was now completely bankrupt, sitting across from the daughter he had consistently evaluated at absolute zero. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the head of the table, letting the heels of my shoes echo against the hardwood floor. "I bought the debt," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the cavernous space of the dining room. "I bought the deed. I bought this entire estate in cash." Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the red folder, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. His hands, usually so firm and commanding when gripping a gavel or a glass of vintage scotch, shook violently against his thighs. I reached into the pocket of my tailored charcoal blazer. My fingers brushed against the crisp paper I had been carrying for 4 years, waiting for the precise moment to return it to its original owner. I pulled the crisp $50 bill from my pocket. I held it between my index and middle finger, letting it catch the bright light of the crystal chandelier above us. With a smooth, elegant motion, I released it. The bill fluttered downward, landing softly right in the center of Thomas's empty china plate. The heavy final reality of my words settled over the room like concrete. There was no legal loophole. There was no rich husband to bail them out. Kendrick was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle on his way to a holding cell, his pregnant mistress likely providing the FBI with every piece of evidence they needed to lock him away for a decade. The Atherton fortune was entirely gone, devoured by the very man they had chosen to worship. Madison let out a sudden, ragged gasp. She pushed herself away from the wall in the foyer, her torn silk dress catching under her knees as she dragged herself forward. She crawled across the threshold of the dining room, completely abandoning the arrogant, superior posture she had worn like a crown just 20 minutes ago. The golden child was shattered. She scrambled over the hardwood floor, her hands smearing the spilled wine as she closed the distance between us. She looked up at me, her face completely unrecognizable. Mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. Her eyes were bloodshot and wild with the animal panic of a woman who had just realized she possessed absolutely no survival skills. She reached out with her trembling, wine-stained hands, grasping frantically at the air, until she lunged forward and threw her arms around my ankles. "Please, Cassidy," Madison begged, her voice a raw, hysterical shriek that clawed at the expensive wallpaper of the dining room. "He is going to jail. The FBI took him. They are going to seize our accounts. They are going to take everything. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing left." She pressed her wet, tear-soaked face against my tailored trousers, sobbing uncontrollably. The sheer pathetic nature of the display would have moved me to pity if I had not spent the last 30 years being subjected to her relentless, calculated cruelty. Every time I had fallen, she had laughed. Every time I had needed help, she had mocked my weakness. "Let me stay here," Madison wailed, her fingers digging desperately into the leather of my shoes. "Please just let me stay in my old room. I will do anything. You cannot throw me out onto the street. We are family. We are sisters." The word hung in the air, desperate and manipulative. Sisters, a title she had proudly discarded the night she laughed at me, shivering in the rain. A title she had only remembered now that she was the one facing the freezing reality of having nowhere to go. I looked down at her sobbing form, feeling absolutely nothing but the quiet, satisfying warmth of total victory. I did not bend down to comfort her. I did not offer a shred of sympathy. I stood perfectly straight, an immovable fortress of the success they had tried to deny me. I tilted my head downward, locking my cold gaze onto her panicked, desperate eyes. "Get your hands off my shoes." Madison scrambled backward, her hands leaving dark smudges of wine across the immaculate leather of my heels. She curled into a pathetic ball against the baseboards, weeping uncontrollably into her ruined silk dress. I did not look at her again. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound cracked through the heavy silence of the dining room. Immediately, the heavy oak doors of the grand foyer swung open. 4 men in immaculate black suits stepped over the threshold, their postures rigid and their expressions entirely devoid of emotion. This was my elite private security detail. They moved with absolute military precision, effortlessly flanking the dining room archway and physically blocking the main exits. Thomas stared at the men, his jaw slackening, as the reality of my power finally materialized in his own home. "This property officially belongs to CW Holdings," I stated firmly, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. "You have exactly 2 hours to pack your personal clothing and leave my premises." Thomas gripped his chest, his breathing turning into shallow, ragged, and desperate wheezes. She scrambled toward the mahogany console table, pulling herself up by grasping the edge of a large Ming Dynasty vase. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room as she mentally cataloged her precious material possessions. She was not mourning her broken family, she was mourning her things. "My antiques," Patricia sobbed, her voice a high, reedy screech that grated against my ears. "Thomas, my jewelry! The Cartier collection in the master suite, the French provincial armoires." She stumbled toward me, her hands clasped together in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Cassidy, please. You have your money. You have your revenge. Let me keep my heirlooms. Let me send for the movers today. You cannot take my grandmother's silver." I looked at the woman who had happily watched Thomas lock me out in the bitter, freezing rain. 10 years ago, she stood in the window, sipping champagne, wearing the exact Cartier diamond necklace she was now begging to keep. I remembered the hunger pains that kept me awake in my college dorm, while she redecorated the guest wing with imported Italian silk. I boldly stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until she was forced to look directly up into my eyes. The absolute coldness in my stare made her physically recoil. She tried to step back, but her wine-soaked heels slipped on the Persian rug. I did not offer a hand to steady her body. I simply watched her struggle to maintain her balance. "Everything bolted to the walls, every piece of furniture, every asset in this house is collateral against the debt you owe me," I said, cutting off her pathetic wailing. "You do not own the French armoires. You do not own the Ming vases. You do not even own the heavy silver spoons sitting on that table." Patricia gasped loudly, clutching her throat as if she were choking on the absolute reality of her sudden, irreversible poverty. "You took out second mortgages to fund your lavish country club lifestyle," I continued relentlessly. "You completely drained the equity to pay for Madison's lavish vacations and your designer silk wardrobes. You spent money that did not belong to you, and now the bill is due." I gestured toward the security guard standing at attention. "Take your clothes and get out. If you attempt to remove a single piece of jewelry, a single painting, or a single silver fork from this property, my security team will detain you, and I will personally press charges for grand larceny. You will leave this estate with exactly what you brought into my life. You take absolutely nothing today." Patricia collapsed heavily into a dining chair, sobbing loudly and burying her tear-stained face deeply in her trembling hands. Thomas remained frozen in his chair, his eyes locked onto the red folder, completely immobilized by the crushing weight of his absolute ruin. He was a silent spectator to the systematic dismantling of his own dynasty. The air smelled of spilled wine and absolute defeat. The federal agents standing near the foyer had remained silent observers to my hostile takeover. They watched the family unravel with clinical detachment. However, the momentary distraction provided the perfect cover for a desperate man. Kendrick, still bleeding and handcuffed, realized the spotlight had temporarily shifted away from his federal crimes. He locked eyes with his pregnant mistress standing near the entryway. With a sudden violent burst of adrenaline, Kendrick shoved his shoulder against the mahogany doorframe, attempting to use the family chaos to slip out the back door and disappear. But the FBI agents swiftly blocked his escape path. Agent Miller did not hesitate. As Kendrick lunged toward the arched threshold leading to the rear terrace, the federal agent dropped his shoulder and drove his entire body weight directly into Kendrick's chest. The brutal impact lifted Kendrick completely off his expensive leather loafers. They crashed backward into the grand foyer, colliding violently with the sweeping mahogany staircase. The heavy, sickening thud of bone against solid wood resonated through the cavernous space. Kendrick thrashed wildly, his face twisted in a feral, desperate grimace, but he was completely outmatched by the trained professionals. The second agent moved in with calculated, ruthless precision. He grabbed Kendrick by the lapels of his ruined designer suit and spun him around, slamming him face first against the custom silk wallpaper. Kendrick let out a breathless grunt as the air was forcefully expelled from his lungs. The agent swept Kendrick's arms backward, twisting his wrists into a harsh, unnatural angle that forced him to stop fighting. The sharp, unforgiving sound of metal clicking shut echoed through the grand foyer. It was a definitive rhythmic noise that signaled the absolute end of Kendrick's fraudulent empire. The handcuffs locked his wrists tightly together, the cold steel biting deeply into his skin. Kendrick Preston, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud. Agent Miller barked, his voice commanding and authoritative, leaving no room for negotiation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Kendrick pressed his bleeding cheek against the beautiful wallpaper, his chest heaving as his breathing grew ragged and uneven. The manic, arrogant energy that had fueled his earlier confessions completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He turned his head slightly, his eyes darting frantically as he desperately searched the entryway for Mia, his pregnant mistress. But the doorway was entirely empty. The very moment the federal agents had engaged Mia had recognized a sinking ship. She had slipped out the front door and vanished into the freezing November evening, abandoning him to the ruins he had created. You have the right to an attorney, the second agent continued, securing an iron grip on Kendrick's bicep and marching him forcefully toward the massive oak front doors. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? Kendrick did not answer. He hung his head in absolute crushing defeat, the tips of his expensive shoes dragging aimlessly across the marble tiles of the entryway. As Kendrick was dragged out into the darkness, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the circular driveway in harsh, sweeping strokes. I walked purposefully toward the front of the house and stood on the sprawling front porch, asserting my dominance over the space. The heavy doors swung partially shut behind me, leaving a chilling draft blowing into the foyer. I turned my attention back to the interior of the mansion. My elite security detail stood perfectly still, their dark suits forming an impenetrable wall around my remaining family members. The 2-hour countdown had officially begun. The eviction process was clinical, efficient, and completely devoid of any human empathy. My security lead, a towering man named Vance, stepped forward and handed Thomas a heavy roll of thick black plastic trash bags. You heard, Miss Wilson, Vance stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble that commanded instant obedience. Personal clothing only. No jewelry, no watches, no electronics. Move. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in psychological dismantling. I stood near the grand staircase watching in absolute silence as my security detail escorted my parents and sister up to their lavish bedroom suites. They were strictly forbidden from using their luxury luggage and imported leather travel trunks, as those items were officially classified as collateral assets belonging to CW Holdings. Instead, the great Atherton family was reduced to stuffing their cashmere sweaters, tailored pants, and silk blouses into cheap black garbage bags. I heard the pathetic, muffled sounds of their weeping echoing down the long, arched hallway. Patricia attempted to sneak a diamond brooch into the pocket of her winter coat, but Vance immediately confiscated it, tossing it carelessly onto a silver decorative tray. The humiliation was absolute. They were being systematically stripped of their wealthy armor, forced to confront the harsh reality of the world, with nothing but the literal clothes on their backs. Exactly 2 hours later, I stood waiting on the front porch of my estate. The bitter autumn wind whipped across the manicured lawns, carrying the sharp, biting scent of impending frost. I pulled my tailored coat tightly around my shoulders, feeling the deeply comforting warmth of my own success. The heavy oak doors creaked open behind me. Madison emerged first, shivering violently in the freezing air. She was dragging 2 heavy black trash bags across the stone porch. The cheap plastic scraped loudly against the concrete, providing a pathetic soundtrack to her total downfall. Her makeup was completely ruined, her perfect hair tangled and blown wildly by the wind. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked out at the long, dark driveway. There were no luxury town cars waiting for them. The bank had repossessed the vehicles weeks ago, leaving them entirely stranded. Madison dropped her garbage bags onto the concrete. She sank to her knees, the cold stone biting through her thin, ruined dress. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Cassidy, please!" Madison sobbed pathetically, her voice cracking as she hugged her arms tightly around her chest. "It is freezing out here. We have no cars. We have no money. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked down at the golden child who had spent her entire existence ensuring I felt unwelcome in my own home. I thought about the night she had locked me out in a torrential downpour, laughing through the pristine glass window as I begged for shelter. I thought about the crisp $50 bill my father had thrown at my feet like a piece of worthless garbage. I met her terrified gaze, my expression completely unreadable and devoid of mercy. "There is a motel off Interstate 5, I replied, my voice slicing through the icy wind with absolute clarity. "It is exactly $50 a night. You should feel right at home." Madison's mouth fell open, a silent scream of comprehension dying in her throat. She finally understood that the mercy she had denied me was the exact mercy she would never receive. Behind her, Thomas and Patricia stumbled out onto the porch. They were carrying their own black trash bags, looking frail, old, and utterly defeated. The wealthy, powerful aristocrats who had ruled this town with an iron fist had been permanently reduced to homeless vagrants hauling garbage. They did not even look at me. The shame of their destruction was too overwhelming. They simply bowed their heads and began walking down the stone steps, marching into the freezing, unforgiving darkness. Madison slowly pushed herself up from the concrete. She grabbed the plastic ties of her trash bags and dragged them down the stairs, following her ruined parents into the cold autumn air. I watched them walk down the long, winding driveway until their figures disappeared completely into the shadows. I stepped backward over the threshold and reached for the polished brass handles. The heavy oak doors of the mansion slammed shut, locking the toxic family out in the cold autumn air forever. 6 months passed. The brutal, unforgiving machinery of the real world processed the Atherton family with absolute indifference. For 3 decades, they had existed inside a heavily insulated bubble of unearned privilege, completely shielded from the harsh consequences of their own narcissism. When that bubble finally popped, the free fall was catastrophic. The vibrant golden autumn shifted into a bitter, relentless winter, freezing over the ruins of their former lives. Thomas Atherton, once the undisputed king of local high society, now spent his days under the buzzing, sterile fluorescent lights of a discount grocery store. At 64 years old, the man who had worn bespoke Italian suits and dictated corporate mergers was reduced to wearing a stiff polyester green apron. He stood behind register number 4, scanning barcode after barcode, his movements slow and rigid with arthritis and suppressed rage. The mountain of credit card debt Patricia had secretly accumulated, combined with the catastrophic legal fees from Kendrick's fallout, had chained Thomas to the register. He spent 8 hours a day bagging canned goods and cheap produce for the exact same working-class people he had spent his entire life mocking and exploiting. Occasionally, former country club acquaintances would walk through his checkout lane. Thomas would physically shrink, dropping his gaze to the scuffed linoleum floor, his face burning with a profound, inescapable humiliation as he handed them their receipts. He had no power left to wield. He was just a tired, broken man ringing up groceries to survive. Across town, Patricia was living her own personalized nightmare. She was relegated to a cramped, depressing Section 8 housing unit on the industrial side of the city. The walls were painted a sickly institutional beige, and the kitchen consisted of peeling laminate countertops and a refrigerator that constantly hummed with a rattling mechanical wheeze. Patricia spent her days sitting in a cheap fabric recliner she had found at a local thrift store, staring blankly at the water stains on the low ceiling. She refused to leave the apartment during daylight hours. The sheer terror of being recognized by her former socialite friends paralyzed her. There were no more charity galas, no more imported French armoires, and no more Cartier diamonds. Her entire identity had been inextricably tied to her material wealth, and without it, she was entirely hollow. She drank cheap boxed wine from a chipped ceramic mug, mourning the absolute loss of her aristocratic facade, while the cold reality of her destitution slowly suffocated her. Madison fared no better. Stripped of her golden child status and her stolen financial security, she was forced to enter the workforce for the first time in her pampered existence. She landed a minimum wage retail job at a fast fashion outlet in a dying suburban mall. Madison spent her days folding endless stacks of cheap polyester shirts, her manicured hands growing rough and calloused. She took orders from a 19-year-old store manager who routinely berated her for being too slow on the cash register. The pristine, untouched princess was now just another exhausted retail worker clocking in for a miserable shift. On her rare days off, Madison took a 2-hour bus ride to the federal penitentiary. She sat in a sterile concrete visiting room, staring through a thick pane of smudged plexiglass at the man who had orchestrated her total destruction. Kendrick wore an oversized orange jumpsuit, his charismatic arrogance entirely replaced by the hollow, sunken stare of a federal inmate. They barely spoke during these visits. They simply sat in tense, bitter silence, communicating only through their shared miserable resentment. He was serving a decade for wire fraud. She was serving a life sentence of mediocrity. Their perfect, enviable marriage was nothing more than a toxic, shattered hallucination. The scene shifts entirely. 3,000 miles away, the air was crisp clean and carrying the faint, salty scent of the Pacific Ocean. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my new penthouse in San Francisco. The sprawling, magnificent skyline stretched out before me, a glittering ocean of city lights cutting through the thick evening fog. I held a delicate crystal glass of expensive, perfectly aged Cabernet, feeling the smooth stem between my fingers. The soft ambient glow of the city illuminated my face, reflecting the absolute, undeniable peace I had finally secured for myself. Behind me, inside the immaculate minimalist living room, the massive flat-screen television was playing the evening financial news. The anchor's voice was crisp and professional, broadcasting the exact headline I had orchestrated. CW Holdings had officially finalized a 9-figure corporate merger, solidifying my firm as an absolute titan in the technology sector. The analysts on the screen marveled at the aggressive, flawless strategy I had employed to secure the deal. They called me a visionary. They called me a relentless force of nature. They called me exactly what I was. I listened to the broadcast for a few moments, letting the words wash over me. Then I turned my head, picked up the remote resting on the patio table, and pressed the power button. The television screen instantly blinked into blackness, plunging the penthouse back into a serene, perfect silence. I turned back towards the balcony railing, resting my hands against the cool glass. The glittering city below me felt alive, vibrant, and completely open to whatever future I chose to dictate. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the sweet, undeniable flavor of absolute victory. They used to tell me I was a failure, I said quietly to the sprawling city skyline, my voice steady, resonant, and completely devoid of doubt. They were half right. I was a failure in the rotten, toxic script they wrote for me. But in the script I wrote for myself, I make the rules. I raised the crystal glass, tilting my head back. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive wine. The screen cuts to black.